Adam Snider first became interested in the psychology of altered states of consciousness as an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, where he wrote his BA thesis on imagination in the work of John Dee. Right now, he's completing a dissertation about clinical practice with ayahuasca users. Adam Snider.
Hello, can you guys hear me all right? Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. So I'm going to be presenting some different experiences and perspectives of a few clinicians that I interviewed who have a lot of experience supporting clients for whom ayahuasca use is traditional. So the role of clinicians is not to promote or recommend use, kind of like we just heard from the Hefter people. It's a little too early for that, but ayahuasca use is a cultural fact. So let's promote client safety and clinician competence. And I would suggest beyond, but including harm reduction. So ayahuasca is used in a variety of settings for a variety of reasons. And although there's a lot of really great research supporting basic safety for members of Brazilian ayahuasca religions, there's really not that much that we know about the kinds of risks and dangers that a lot of people who might come to a therapist are going to be exposed to. Most users might be not aligned with any particular organization. So the fact is, we really don't know what they're drinking, what the risks are, how well it works for them, but we are beginning to learn about intentions, why people are going to these ceremonies. So Charles Grove, Dennis McKenna, Dr. Brad Adams recently collected longitudinal data on 3 cohorts of North American participants in an ayahuasca retreat in the Sacred Valley of Peru. And these are not members of any particular church or organization. They're modern, urban people. Dr. Adams invited me to collaborate with him on developing coding schemes for some of the data sets. And I thought one of them that was particularly interesting and relevant to clinicians would be the intentions. So we found that about 96% of the respondents fit into these 4 categories: learning, growth, healing, and connection. And there's a variety of different types of learning that people reported. So we wanted to capture some of the different levels of these 4 variables. So some examples from what people reported of their intentions include to release and heal myself from emotional wounds. So we categorize that as a healing psychological. Another example was to open myself, to unlock portals, to awaken my gifts and powers. So we categorize that growth indistinguishable. People talked about a lot of forms of connection, connecting with family members more, connecting with themselves more, connecting with more spiritual or transcendent. So other people just reported that they'd like to have more success in their business or other things like that, so we just called that other. Okay. So for my dissertation, I interviewed 9 clinicians. Many of them I found from the MAPS integration list or word of mouth. They were given a semi-structured interview, and they had they had 33 clients total. And this presentation includes aggregated info from all of them, as well as some focused attention on a few of them. So the goal of this project wasn't really to make something generalizable or create guidelines, but it was just to contrast a variety of some different perspectives in the field, articulate some various issues that clinicians might face. So after doing a pretty extensive lit review, I looked at 4 scenarios that clients might be in, and I want to present 3 of those here. So the concept of spiritual emergency is from transpersonal psychology. Stan Groff and Christina Groff wrote a book called Spiritual Emergency: When Spiritual when personal transformation becomes a crisis. And we actually see in the DSM that there's a code for spiritual or religious problem. It's not a diagnosis, it's called a V code. So it may be used by some clinicians to document a spiritual emergency without associating it with a diagnosis, like a brief psychotic episode. I want to read a brief quote about this phenomena from Stan and Christina Groff. The process of growth and change becomes chaotic and overwhelming. Individuals experience such episodes may feel that their sense of identity is breaking down, that their old values no longer hold true, and that the very ground beneath their personal realities is radically shifting. In many cases, new realms of mystical and spiritual experience enter their lives suddenly and dramatically, resulting in fear and confusion. They may feel tremendous anxiety and have difficulty coping with their daily lives, jobs, and relationships, and may even fear for their own sanity. So if a clinician isn't familiar with these kinds of possibilities, then it's easy to mistake a potentially healing opportunity for something that's simply harmful or pathological. And the Groffs found 10 forms that they talk about here. So, in many ways, the concept of spiritual bypass, another scenario clients might be in, is the opposite of spiritual emergency, although it could still impact functioning. So rather than a sense of emergency in which the client is actually experiencing painful, distressing psychic content, spiritual bypass is when a client uses spiritual practices to avoid or bypass their painful emotions. So in the reference on the screen, Tritzscher wrote, participating in an ayahuasca ceremony in and of itself creates a risk of falling into old patterns, newly masked. A field consultant reported it as a loss of functioning, such as not showering or washing one's clothes. So you might be familiar with the enlightened guru syndrome. That's kind of what we're talking about here. Whereas many more clients of the 33 clients, the 9 clinicians I interviewed, many of them, compared to this scenario, had spiritual emergency, about half. But here, there's very few. And from what I read about things like ayahuasca tourism and other phenomena, I was wondering if there would be even more spiritual bypass. And so really the results I'm showing are very biased. There's a small sample size. And so these aren't meant to really generalize to what's happening in general, but I just wanted to show a snapshot of what some clinicians are seeing. So another and perhaps even more problematic scenario is harmful or dangerous use. So some examples from the interviews I found where the ayahuasca ceremony itself was considered to be the precipitating event of PTSD. There's also neglect or abuse by facilitators. Clinicians should ask about, watch out for. Unresolved lingering confusion was the most common, they described, though. Psychedelic shame was a new one to me. I had never heard of that. One of my consultants talked about how many participants might feel guilty that they didn't have the experience that their friends hoped that they would have. And so there's all of these different types of possible harm that patients might experience. Although calling it harm and danger presupposes that they may not get the support that would otherwise turn a harmful situation into a healing crisis, as Groff talked about. So I want to go now into a little more depth of some of the interviews I did. So this is Vicki Craft. She's a unique example of a clinician who's also part of an ayahuasca drinking community. She not only participates in the community, but is also able to serve ayahuasca to others because the Santo Daime is a fully above-ground legal church now. It has DEA approval to import ayahuasca from Brazil and serve it in religious contexts. So Vicki has perspective on what clients might experience and also perspective on some of the community norms that ayahuasca communities might consider normal, but clinicians might not be so familiar with. And I think it's important that we base our evaluations and our treatment in cultural norms rather than imposing psychiatric norms on client experience. So she stated, well, mediumship actually is a fairly common experience, communication with spirits, things like this that clinicians could be aware of. So she stated, mediumship is a phenomenon that many people have experienced or believe in. And she gave an expanded definition of mediumship that includes more than what we might normally associate with the term. So Vicki said that the most common experience in the Santo Daime is actually conscious mediumship, where the being or spiritual content appears to a conscious observer. So it's not necessarily a loss of consciousness or having your consciousness replaced by something else. Although there is a form where a person is not conscious when the mediumship is happening. And both of these are considered normal forms of incorporation. Clients may also talk about receiving hymns, images, or other content. I asked her, how can other clinicians better understand mediumship experiences? And she really emphasized the clinician characteristics, not so much that it's necessary to believe what the clients believe in about their experiences, but be able to see their experience as a potential healing opportunity. And ideally, the clinician would have had some kind of transpersonal experience themselves, not necessarily with the substance, but something that would allow them to reference some of these unusual experiences people might report that actually turn out to be not so unusual in a community context. And the value of that is helping the clinician understand the cultural grounding of what they're seeing and help them better differentiate a brief psychotic episode from spiritual emergency. So what if a clinician is an atheist with no transpersonal experience, but open-minded? Vicki discussed how certain psychological theories may be a bridge for some clinicians to conceptualize client experiences, such as being multiple and interacting with autonomous personality structures. One approach she discussed is called internal family systems, or IFS. This is an empirically validated model and has the status of being an evidence-based practice, and therefore relatively mainstream. I'll do my best to summarize the model. I know there's some IFS therapists in the audience. All right, so the IFS therapist connects clients to a feeling of being calm and compassionate. This is kind of the first thing. Connect them to this, which is considered the natural state of mind. Then, from this place, which they've managed to stabilize, even just temporarily perhaps, from this place, guides the clients to open to and interact with their burdened parts. It helps clients unblend from and welcome their parts, dialoguing with them, hearing their stories, all moving towards restoring the natural and innate balance of the mind, the internal family system, which is considered naturally multiple and led by an emergent energy of compassion rather than any particular part. So from this IFS perspective, we may be taken over by a strong part that rises up and sits in the seat of consciousness and looks through our eyes. To quote an IFS collaborator, Locke Kelly of the Open-Hearted Awareness Institute. So, Vicki stated that a client may have incorporated a destructive spirit. Now, you don't have to look at it necessarily from the lens of incorporation. A clinician who doesn't understand or may be skeptical about such ideas can work with this phenomena using models like IFS. Not that they have to practice IFS, but they can be aware that this is how some clinicians work, and this is also part of a normal range of clinical experience. So another approach we discussed is Carl Jung's method of active imagination. Although it's not an evidence-based practice like IFS, it's another approach that might help build bridges. So Jung described risks associated with what he called the transcendent function, opening a portal to the unconscious. One such risk that might help contextualize mediumship-type experiences is what Jung called identification with the archetype. And I encourage you to check out the Red Book for what might be called Jung's personal mediumship experiences. Okay. I talked to Erika Siegel, who's another psychotherapist and harm reduction expert, about the roles of the clinician and how clinicians can who are interested in more than just clinical work with this population can navigate some of the interesting ethical and possibly legal dilemmas that may arise. So the same person might play different roles at different times. And for that reason, it's important to keep the roles clear. These are two peer support roles that clinicians might play when they're not in the role of clinician. So harm reduction is a peer support role, often in the context of acute psychedelic distress or intoxication, but not always. And so with acute psychedelic distress or intoxication, a harm reduction person may experience in something like a, well, I think this kind of started in Woodstock, and they had bad trip tents where they took people to help them not get arrested, basically. And so it's about community policing in some ways, and it's about encouraging a person to lie down, drink water, be with them, help them in various ways, but not provide interventions, because, of course, you can't get consent. Another role clinicians might play when they're not in the role of clinician is integration support. And this is a little more complex than harm reduction because it looks a little more like clinical work. So this is after acute effects of psychedelics. And I asked Erika to help us differentiate these roles. And she talked about how, whereas a clinical role is about confidentiality, case conceptualization, interventions, peer support is a little different. It's about non-directive. It's about being a witness, communicating acceptance, encouraging self-compassion, providing education on the risks of psychedelics, encouraging health-promoting behaviors such as safety planning, and self-care practices. Also connecting them to social support. But Rogerian and client-centered therapy have researched and defined some of these same peer support activities and constituted them as psychotherapeutic interventions. And they're practiced in clinical contexts, blurring the boundaries between the roles. So when facilitating integration circles, clinicians may be subject to more ethical and legal dilemmas than non-clinician peers, such as possibly being blamed for bad results of support given in a peer group that looks like an intervention in court. Yet this shouldn't deter sensible clinicians. Erika asked, can a clinician run an AA group? Of course. So it's interesting to note, though, that she did leave a particular integration circle because she felt that her co-facilitator, another clinician, wasn't adequately separating the roles enough, being a little too directive. And I think this is an interesting new issue that follows new cultural developments around ayahuasca. Cole Marta is a psychiatrist, and he's also working on the ongoing MAP-sponsored MDMA clinical trials in Los Angeles. And he also has experience consulting with clients for whom ayahuasca use is significant, or consulting with other psychiatrists and other clinicians who are supporting these clients. So he talked about how there's going to be different issues faced by different professions, right? Psychiatrists, unlike many other therapists, are responsible for consultation, med management. Psychiatrists may be asked by patients about ayahuasca and how it may interact with their meds, or they may seek acute stabilization for psychedelic distress. And Cole's perspective was really that psychiatry itself can be a wisdom tradition. He's interested in new research around mystical experience, challenging experience rating scales, all done from a scientific perspective. Stan Groff, for example, worked within psychiatry, but he helped us incorporate more traditions to better understand some of the phenomena that we might see. So he commented also that we should watch out for scientific bypassing, whereas spiritual bypassing is using spirituality to avoid our emotional issues. Scientific bypassing is using science to avoid spiritual phenomena that is often clinically relevant. So we can't just reduce it to pathology, which makes it a lot more challenging, but also a lot more interesting. Another consultant I talked to was Dr. Naeem. He's an integrative psychiatrist. He emphasized self-care practices and lifestyle choices outside the office that promote healthy regulation of physiological processes that help people's ayahuasca experiences take root. So much mental health is food and lifestyle, activities, how you care for yourself. Many authors have discussed meaning making in psychoanalytic or psychodynamic contexts, drawing from traditional talk therapy to represent modern psychotherapy. However, there have been great advances in trauma research that have happened since the advent of transpersonal psychology. New approaches such as somatic experiencing and sensory motor psychotherapy focus on somatic processes and not necessarily meaning making in a symbolic or cognitive way. Dr. Naeem emphasized engaging with, doing, mindfulness practice, supportive group experiences. And he said, just seeing things differently may lead to an awakening, but that awakening only leads to neuroplastic changes towards a more well-regulated state if it is supported by lifestyle changes. He also said, my experience working with people who drink ayahuasca is that it can give profound insights, but insights must culminate in new habits of self-regulation and new mastery for maintaining our integrity. Bringing our will, our intentionality into alignment with our behaviors in regard to our health. And this is really a view of a more holistic, integrative notion of integration. So bringing our will, our intentionality into alignment with our behaviors in regard to our health, the health of our family and community, and the natural world as a whole. This is the intrinsicality of virtue that Claudio Naranjo speaks about, where awakening experiences of any kind reveal to us our more essential nature. Acting with love is to show reference for life. Okay, so I want to leave some time for Q&A, but I just want to mention before that there's an important addition to this field that really needs to be made. I've insinuated that there's this hidden population that's seeking psychotherapy and that therefore psychotherapists should become more competent to support them. But really, we need a needs assessment study to see if there really is this population out there that's interested in mental health services but may not be able to access the care they perceive they need. And so one of my field consultants, Dr. Brian Anderson, talked about the importance of meeting with community stakeholders, people in the communities who drink ayahuasca, letting them participate in this, letting them help to define what would be helpful for mental health clinicians to learn more about and really participate in this new evolving cultural paradigm. And I want to leave some time for Q&A, so leave it at that. Thank you. Thanks.
If you have questions, please come to the mic.
Hi, Adam.
Hi.
Thanks for your beautiful talk. What are your thoughts about individuals that go to ayahuasca ceremonies and forego therapy or meeting with mental health professionals because they are afraid of being diagnosed?
I think that's a big problem, and that's something that I'm trying to address in my work, is helping clinicians understand that what may look like a mental disorder may actually be an opportunity. Now, that doesn't mean that clinicians can't also code it in the DSM as a mental disorder if they need to. But as far as treating clients, I think it's really a case-by-case basis. So I don't have any, to answer your question, I actually don't have any general comments on that. I think it's important to understand that talking about drugs is like, with your therapist, is like talking about your sexual practices, right? And if you're in the minority, then you might be concerned about some bias, and rightly so. Thank you.
Hey, Adam. My name is Carrie. I just want to say, first of all, I'm love to have lunch with anybody here who's a therapist, also working with clients who work with ayahuasca after this. So come look for me in the lobby, green coat. I live in Peru. I work as a psychotherapist with integration. And my question for you is, in this context of your last slide, asking for feedback from people in ayahuasca communities, is this something you're actively setting up? Do you have a structure for this in place?
The structure is getting in place currently, but if you can email me, I'd really appreciate your input. And if anyone else would like to be part of this discussion, please email me. There's a lot of people working on this right now, actually. I'm trying to create a resource, not so much guidelines. And so in that resource, it would be great if it included a lot of different perspectives, especially from the communities who I'm actually trying to build bridges with as a mental health person.
So just to clarify, to stay in touch with this structure, we get in touch with you and you'll let us know.
Yeah, please do. And again, there's also other people that are doing this kind of work. So thank you.
Hello, just to reiterate, even in the field of cannabis, there are people who come in who are concerned that other therapists, the moment that they mention cannabis use, the therapist goes into assessing for abuse. There's still, so even at that level, so I'm concerned when there would be guidelines, because I'm concerned about if someone were to discuss their ayahuasca use, what can you possibly recommend that they do some sort of like meditative practice, or are you on some level not advocating for it, but you're helping them? And you don't want to get into legal issues or have your license threatened because of that. So it would just be an amazing resource if there were some sort of guidelines or best practices, so that if you were to explain yourself, at least you could point to these guidelines and document that you're observing them.
I agree. Thank you for your comment. Okay. Okay, thanks. Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
I can't resist. As the week goes on, I'm getting more and more mouthy. The Ninth Circuit Federal Court gave a permanent injunction which said that clinicians could not be prevented from talking to their clients about anything. And that was in response to when General McCaffrey was the drug czar. And so clinicians are among the best protected people in talking about this kind of thing. That's only in the states that are under the jurisdiction of the Ninth Circuit, however.